Hi everyone, so far I've made 3 animations in Blender's Grease Pencil, and today I'm going to show you how I made my latest with as much detail as possible, so you can try a Grease Pencil for yourself. I've started creating a monthly animation to a prompt on my Discord server and sharing them here. The first was outside, this one was down. I wanted to use a camera move to fill the prompt while also playing around with layering background and animated sections. As usual, I started off by making the background. I did this one in TVPaint, but use whatever you're comfortable with. Some free art programs you can use are Krita, Firealpaca, Gimp and Photopea. If there are any others you'd recommend, post them in the comments below. So my canvas was pretty big at 1920 by 6500 pixels. I started with a rough sketch to figure out where I wanted everything placed, and a few times I scaled down my sketch to add buildings or extra details. Once I was happy with it, I started on the grayscale version. I used 4 to 5 shades of grey to block out the shapes, each part in a different layer, so I could easily export the background later to bring into Blender. Next up was adding detail. I used the stencil function in TVPaint, which works much like a clipping mask, to add details in new layers. Each was positioned above the layer I was working on and color-coded or renamed to make it easier to export with the grayscale. When the detail was finished, I used a gradient with a blending mode set to colorize to add a base to the background. I then used different colours, mainly pink, purple, blue and yellow, with different blending modes to finish it off. Exporting this took a little longer than I planned for because I needed each layer to be a transparent PNG. And the gradient was not cut to any specific layer and instead was placed over the top. To fix this, I had to duplicate the gradient for each separate part I wanted to export and delete what I didn't need. I used the stencil function to speed things up, saved each section in a numbered order to make things easier, and then it was time to bring it all into Blender. I made a new 2D animation project and went to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and in the search bar I typed Planes and ticked Import Images as Planes. I then went to File, Import Images as Planes. I found my background layers and selected all of them by clicking and dragging, or you can hit A on the keyboard. I then selected Offset Planes and chose the Z+ option with an offset of 0, so my images would be stacked in front of each other. Select Import and the images should appear on the canvas. If they're too small, as mine were, you'll want to scale and move them. Go to Object Mode in the upper left-hand corner or use Ctrl-Tab to bring up the radial menu. You can select your images with the lasso tool and use left-click and hold it over the tools with a small triangle in the corner to see other options. Beneath the Select and Cursor tools are the Move, Rotate, Scale and Transform tools. I used S for Scale and G for Move to bring my images where I wanted them. I then adjusted each individual layer along the Z-axis, scaling up the buildings and dock. You can select individual layers in the collection in the top right-hand corner. I wanted the layers to be a little larger than the camera view, so I didn't accidentally see the edges during any movement I wanted to make. Moving some layers closer to the camera and others away from it will give the impression of depth. This is similar to how parallax is created in landscape scenes to give a faux 3D effect and make it look like different parts of your animation are moving at different speeds. To move around your canvas, you can use your mouse or the options on the right-hand side. Rotate your view here, zoom in and out with the magnifying glass, move using the hand tool, and this one will switch in and out of the camera view. To use multiple views, right-click on the menu bar at the top and select Vertical Split. Move your cursor across the screen and left-click to accept the change. To remove it, right-click on the menu bar and select Close Area. You can also click and drag from the corners of the screen once your cursor changes to this crosshair. To animate the camera, I needed to select it from the collection in the upper right hand corner. Stay in object mode and use the move tool on the left to access its controller. In the bottom panel, I switched to Dope Sheet, and I made a keyframe to keep this first position by right-clicking on the timeline and selecting Insert Keyframe. The shortcut for this is I. If you have Auto Keyframe activated and move the camera, a keyframe will be made for you. Moving to the first frame, I then repositioned the camera using the controller. You can also use the sidebar options for location, rotation, and scale here. If you don't have this menu, go to View, Sidebar at the top. These options will be under Item. I then added keyframes for the rest of the camera points. If I wanted the camera to hold, I would duplicate the last keyframe by clicking it and using Shift D. Left clicking would place the keyframe and right clicking would remove the duplicate. To adjust the timing further, I switched Dope Sheet to Graph Editor. You can select multiple points by clicking and dragging, or selecting individual points with one left click and adjusting the handles of the points like that. Right-clicking on the frame will bring up the interpolation and easing if you want to adjust them that way. With the camera move finished, it's time to take a look at Draw Mode. Change from Object Mode to Draw Mode in the top left-hand corner, or use Shift-Tab to bring up this menu. Your tools will be on the left-hand side. With the Draw tool selected, I can change my brush and whether I want to control the colour through the material or attribute settings. You can also access material, attribute and the colour wheel in the Active Tool and Workspace settings. To draw or colour with material selected means you need to make a new material every time you want to add a new colour to your grease pencil object, as adjusting the base colour after drawing will change the colour everywhere you have used it. You can add new materials or adjust them in the Material Properties tab on the right hand side. Hit the plus and New to add one. Using the material setting is good for projects with a limited palette or if you change your mind a lot. You can adjust your material to be stroke, fill, or both, and have separate colours for each. Changing these settings will affect your drawing if you've already used it elsewhere in the project. So if you want to make a change, it's best to do that before you start or make a new material. I use the attribute setting more often because you don't need to make new materials every time. You can just change the colour as you would in a normal drawing program. You can change the size and pressure of your brush here. The advanced and stroke menus give you extra options for adjusting your brush. If I'm lining, I'll use the stabilizer to get a smoother line, which you can also toggle by holding Shift while drawing. For most of this animation, I use my brush pack, which you can download through the link in the description. If you started a new 2D project, you should have a grease pencil object already there. It's called a stroke and can be found inside the collections in the top right hand corner. Click it and go down to the panel at the bottom and change this to grease pencil. This is where you'll see your layers and keyframes. If you don't have a grease pencil object in your collections or you need to add a new one, you can go to Object Mode at the top, click Add, Grease Pencil, and then choose either blank or stroke. The difference between the two is that stroke already comes with more materials and layers and a line on your canvas. You can get rid of the line by going to Edit Mode, selecting the line and hitting Delete Stroke. Or you can go back to Draw Mode, select the eraser and set it to either point or stroke. To see your layers, go to Object Data Properties, which looks like a little looped cable. Use the plus and minus to add and remove layers. Use the up and down arrows to rearrange them, and the layer specials, which looks like a little V in the middle, to see extra options. The ones I use the most from this menu are duplicating the layer and duplicating the layer with empty frames, which is helpful for colouring later. You can also merge layers here too. Double click with the left mouse button to rename your layers. You can also activate the onion skin and hide and lock the layers here too. This option shows whether a mask is being used. For the seagull, which was my first animated element in this project, I loosely sketched out the key poses in my rough layer. I then dragged the frames along the timeline to get the timing I wanted. You can move along the timeline frame by frame using the left and right arrow keys, or skip to the next and previous keyframes with the up and down arrows on your keyboard. If you want to, you can set your frame type, which will color code them. To do this, select the frames, right-click and go to Keyframe Type. I wanted a lineless style for this bird, so with the roughs selected in the Layer panel, I hit the Layer Specials and chose Duplicate Empty Keyframes. I switched to the ink pen and made sure the color attribute was selected, changing to an off-white for the wings of the bird and started filling it in, changing the colour when I wanted to add details like the bird's beak, eyes and lines on the wings. Once the bird was finished, I wanted to turn it into a loop without needing to duplicate the frames. To do this, go to Modifier Properties, which looks like a wrench. Select Add Modifier and from the drop-down, Time Offset. Tick Custom Range and put in the first and last frame of the section you want to loop. Instead of animating another bird, I decided to reuse my first. I wanted this one to enter the left side of the canvas and swoop across the screen, exiting on the right. I went to the collections and duplicated my first bird by selecting it and using Ctrl+C to copy and Ctrl+V to paste. It may appear in a random place, but you can just click and drag it to a collection or use Ctrl+M to add it to a new one. This also works for multiple selections too and is a great way to keep everything organised. I made sure to rename it so I wouldn't get confused. With Bird 2 selected, I used the same process when animating the camera. I went to Object Mode, changed Grease Pencil to Dope Sheet at the bottom, and used the tools and shortcuts to keyframe the path I wanted the bird to take. I then adjusted the points in the graph editor. Adding in a new grease pencil object, I started animating my character and the dog. Holding Control and drawing would switch temporarily to the eraser, which was super helpful. I'll usually have the eraser set to point. Stroke is good for larger areas and Dissolve is more of a traditional eraser and good for fine detail. I started with the rough animation layer, sketching out the key poses in a bright yellow. To speed up the process and add in smaller movements, I switched to Sculpt mode and with the push tool adjusted the drawing. When I was lining the characters, I duplicated the rough layer with blank keyframes and switched to my chunky brush from my Blender brush pack. To make things easier, I animated my character's hair, the body and the dog in separate layers. This meant I could give the hair a bit of movement in the beginning, while the character's body remained still and the dog could move independently from my character without having to redraw it too. Because this section was lined and not lineless like my bird, I used the bucket fill on a new layer to colour it. I made a new material with fill selected and I kept to the attribute colour setting because I didn't want to add more materials. I do have a set colour palette for my character, so I grabbed the hex codes from another project and clicked on the colour at the top and hit Add New Palette, making sure the shield, Fake User, was activated. If this was off and I closed Blender, it would remove the colours the next time I opened the program. I changed the name of my palette and clicked on the left colour. I switched to hex code, put in the first number, and then clicked the plus to add new palette colour. Sometimes the fill tool worked, sometimes it bugged a little, so I improvised and made a new material with fill selected. Switched over to the draw tool and filled in any empty areas like that. Blender has just released a new update, so hopefully that's fixed in the new one. With the characters finished, I added in a new grease pencil object and started animating the water. This one was slightly different in that I animated straight ahead. This often works better for action sequences and FX animation. I focused on different sections of the water in the rough stage, using multiple layers to focus on the splashes against the dock or when the wave would roll out of view. And I did this until I was happy with how it looked. I had two lines acting as a guide to show where the top and bottom of the wave would be. Making a new layer, I then focused on animating the bottom section, using the top as a reference, and the onion skin helped keep things smooth. I then merged my rough water layers and lowered the opacity. Duplicating the rough layer with empty frames, I used a new material that had both strokes and fills activated with the same colour in each. What really helped keep my lines super smooth during this was using the stabilizer, which can be activated by holding Shift and drawing. Releasing it will return the brush to normal. To show a difference between the water above and below, I needed to add a gradient beneath the waterline. There's probably an easier way of doing this, but I made a new layer and used one of my brushes with a dark purple colour to add some texture. I duplicated the frames to match that of my wave animation and then changed to sculpt mode to push each texture frame beneath the wave. Once that was done, I lowered the opacity of the layer and changed the blend mode to multiply. There's only a few blend modes here at the moment, so I'd love to see them add more in the future. As the camera travels down through the water, I wanted some fish to swim across the canvas. In a new grease pencil object, I used a brush with a fill material to draw the silhouette of a fish. I then made 4 more frames to give it a boiling line effect, before remembering I could go to Modifier properties, add Modifier, and select Noise. This gives the layer anything from a slight boil to a more extreme wiggle, and it's super fun to test out the different settings. I made a few more fish in new grease pencil objects and duplicated them to fill up the space, switching to object mode to move and scale them for some variation. If you want to copy modifiers to multiple other objects, you'll want to select the object with the modifier you want to copy first, then hold Shift, and select the others you want to copy the modifier to. These should be a brighter colour than the first. Then, in the modifier settings, click this drop down and hit Copy to Selected. I thought the flat colour of the fish was a bit bland, so in the object data properties for each fish, I made a new layer above the first. I used a brush from my brush pack to create a texture over the top, and changed the blend mode to multiply and lowered the opacity. Next, I ticked masks and hit the plus to link it to the fish layer. With the noise modifier active on the object, I would only have to draw 1 frame of texture. Without it, I would have to mirror the frames of the fish and redraw them to achieve a boil. Masks are super useful for adding light, shadow, and texture, so I would really recommend using them if you want to add a little extra something to your animations. I then keyframed the fish to move across the screen using object mode and the dope sheet. Their movement would start just before the camera reached them and end once the camera had passed to make it look nice and smooth. Finally, it was time to animate the eye in the cave. I looked at references for lizards opening their eyes because I wanted this creature to have a second eyelid, which definitely made it look creepier. For me, it's a lot easier to separate out the different elements when animating and colouring, as it's quicker to adjust without having to worry about editing other parts accidentally. Be sure to lock the layers you're not working on if you're editing, erasing, or using the sculpting tools. I used masks here too to add a darker texture around the yellow of the eye, testing out the blend modes and opacity to get the look I wanted. Then I added a texture on a new layer behind the eye animation, which I called Mass, and added 2 noise modifiers. One very subtle version that would affect the eye, and another stronger version that would affect only the texture behind it. To do this, I used the Influence dropdown and changed the layer to Mass. Without choosing Influence, the whole grease pencil object will be affected. My final step was to export the animation and bring it into the free version of Davinci Resolve, where I'd add the finishing touches with some sound effects and music. To export my animation, I'd go to the Output properties on the right. My resolution was 1920 by 1080, 24 frames a second, with a frame range of 1 to 400. I'd then choose where I wanted to save the file and chose FFmpeg Video and RGB Color. I set it to H.264 and high quality. If there had been audio, I would have set it to AAC. I left the rest of the settings alone, and then at the top, I went to render and render animation. If you've stuck around to the end, you're amazing. Subscribe and hit the bell if you want to see more stuff from me, and here is the final animation.